I'll let everyone in. Excellent. All right. Welcome everybody to our first webinar in a while, but certainly the first one on our disruption of drug development, patient-centered research. So this is a bit of a three-part series. We'll be doing a couple of webinars this week, next week, and the week after, just on what our clinical research is, starting off with a bit about the history of clinical research and a bit of like a literature review and the existing research that's out there and how it's structured. Next week, we'll get a bit into the patient-funded model, and then the third week, we'll talk about Silwell, which is the trial we're running. Just going to get everything set up here and maybe wait 1 or 2 more minutes for people to join in as they're still coming in. I'm approving them. But otherwise, just for a bit of housekeeping, we'd love for this to be a bit of a conversation. So feel free to use the chat, pop questions in there. I'll keep my eye on it. Maybe you do the same thing. And Alex, feel free also to like interrupt us if you think there's a good pressing question. We don't mind being interrupted. That's fine. I feel like it's always better to get to the question right when it pops up or on the slide instead of waiting all the way to the end. But that being said, we'll still have a lot of time for conversation if it can wait, hopefully at the end of the call. So let's get started here. I'll just give myself a real quick introduction, then I'll introduce client, introduce yourself. So I'm Spencer Hawkswell. I'm the president and CEO of TheraSil. Kamaya, over to you.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Kamaya Lawrence, and I'm the clinical research director at Hippo Science.
Awesome. And let's get started. Kamaya, you can maybe jump to the next slide there. Awesome. So I want to start this off just talking a little bit about TheraSil. I'm cognizant that there might be some people kind of new to what TheraSil is as we've put this out to all of our socials, LinkedIn and whatnot. So I want to just bring those who are new to the organization up to speed on what we do. So we are a nonprofit. We started about 5 or 6 years ago in Victoria, advocating for patient rights to psychedelics, specifically psilocybin at the time. Really what we do is global training, research, and grassroots advocacy to try and create better legal pathways to psychedelics through medical regulations, compassionate access, and doing all of that with research and our 4 pillars here, which are advocacy, education, community education, and patient-centered research. So we'll really be diving into the research side of that here in this call. All right. Next slide there. All right. A little bit just about Hippo as well. Hippo is the CRO that's working alongside TheraSil. It too wants to enable patients to participate in the research process. We'll get more into that in these next couple slides and in the next presentations. But essentially, we want patients being the ones in charge of funding research and thus deciding how research is conducted. We want them to be the ones who are making decisions that lead to outcomes that they can control. We also want to lower the development costs of clinical trials. We've been able to do that almost by 90% and accelerate the funding and to market. All right, next slide. So a little bit about our team. We are a small organization, TheraSil, but a mighty one. So these are the team members. Essentially, we've got operations, communications, clinical programs, research, and a legal side. It's a small but mighty team, and together we kind of run the organization. All right. So I just want to touch a little bit more on TheraSil. We really started back in 2017 by helping this gentleman here, Thomas Hartle. Thomas was a stage 4 cancer patient who had serious end-of-life distress. And this is at a time back in 2020, just after the government of Canada had approved medical assistance in dying. And just as a bunch of really great studies were coming out of University of Imperial College, NYU, And these studies were showing that a single dose of psilocybin were making marked changes in people's end-of-life distress. So the demoralization, anxiety, depression that comes with an end-of-life diagnosis, a single dose of psilocybin was helping them. Now, these were stuck in phase 1 and 2 clinical trials. However, it gets to a point where if someone has the right to die with medical assistance in dying, you would think they have the right to try with psilocybin. So we wanted to try and make a case, even though there was lacking research, it was really just done at the institutions. We wanted to make a case for why individuals in Canada should be able to access psilocybin on compassionate grounds. And that was done the first time with Thomas. We had advocated for about 100 days, and finally we got what's called a Section 56 approved, which is not really legal access or pathways to a drug, but really just an exemption from the laws. And it says that you can go out and procure and use psilocybin mushrooms without breaking the law. We helped about 50 patients and healthcare professionals access that same exemption, both for treatment and for training purposes, before the SAP was amended to allow for access. Now, the SAP is the Special Access Program. It's been used in Canada for many, many years, mostly for patients who are trying to seek drugs that are not approved in Canada, but might be effective, even though they haven't gone through the Canadian approval processes. So you can think about perhaps cancer drugs that are shown really effective in Europe or have been approved by health authorities, over there or in Asia or the US, but have not been approved by Health Canada for one reason or another. This allows access. And similarly, it was allowing people access to psilocybin. The problem was that it was expensive, really expensive, about $5,000 for patients. And that was mainly due to the fact that we had to go through 6-month wait times. So people were working with their doctors for up to 6 months to try and get through the paperwork. Doctors are very expensive. Oftentimes lawyers were also involved, and lawyers are very expensive. And sometimes time is the biggest expense that people have. They cannot afford to wait. So although we were able to get people like Thomas access after a lot of fighting, there were a lot of people that did not get access, unfortunately. And we wanted to change that. So what we have done over the past couple of years is continue to train healthcare professionals, about 600, perhaps even more at this point. We've helped hundreds of patients through the SAP, but now we're also starting to look forward. How can we support existing research and create new research in Canada that might actually get to the root of the problem here? The root of the problem is we do not have drugs, psychedelic drugs that are approved, that doctors can prescribe, that people can use for, both end-of-life distress, but also the many other indications that they're trying to get access to. Over the last couple of years, we've helped people with cluster headaches access psilocybin for cluster headaches, with major depressive disorder, with anxiety, and many other indications that may not be on track to approval in our traditional models. So we're now looking to see if it's possible for our clinical research to help people. All right, next slide. Maya, did you want to take over at this point?
Sure. So this kind of brings us into the question of why don't we have legal psychedelics? Why is it taking so long? Why does it seem so difficult for this to happen? And overwhelmingly, the answer that we've received from regulatory bodies, including Health Canada and the FDA, is that there is insufficient clinical evidence to reschedule psychedelics. What this boils down to really is that there's insufficient safety data to show that psilocybin or any psychedelic is available, should be available to people to use safely. And so this has led to the huge push for clinical research. We need that research to basically show these regulatory bodies that it is safe for people to use and that people should be able to use it. So the way that clinical research happens is overwhelmingly within these two streams. There is academic or grant-led research, and then there is research that is sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. If we start with the academic or grant-led stream, this is research that is being performed strictly for the sake of knowledge. It's scientists who have devoted their lives to answering questions simply for the sake of knowing. The problems that we face here is that it's slow moving. And the reason why it's slow moving is because research is just very underfunded It's very hard for these investigators to get government grants, and oftentimes philanthropic funding is one of the best ways to perform research because there's no return on investment here. Um, Furthermore, there's a lot of stigma still surrounding psychedelics, and we believe that this further limits funding that's available. So all in all, academic and grant-based research is definitely furthering our knowledge and producing safety data that is helpful, but likely won't lead to the legalization of psychedelics, at least not in a frame of time that we would expect given the momentum that this space has seen. On the flip side, we have pharmaceutical-led research. And so this is research that's performed for the sake of a DIN. A DIN is a drug identification number. This is a number that pharmacies use to fill prescriptions. And so pharmaceutical companies are overwhelmingly motivated to produce data to show that their drugs are safe and efficacious. The problem here is that a lot of psychedelics are natural products, and this means that they're unpatentable. There's not a lot of interest from big pharmaceutical companies to research a drug product that they won't be able to control via a patent. And so we're not seeing a lot of headway from the pharmaceutical side of things. If big pharma were to be involved in psychedelic research, it would likely be with the expectation of there being an indication associated with it. An indication is something like depression, anxiety, or PTSD. And furthermore, the scope of the objectives and the results that we would get from this research would be very much limited to results that are kind of cherry-picked for marketability of that drug product. So overall, we're seeing that pharmaceutical-led research probably isn't a viable pathway to legalization. And we also see that academic research is probably not going to get us there at the speed that we would like. If we look towards current literature, with current psychedelic literature, we see some gaps. And overwhelmingly, we see unrealistic design and sample populations. We see that the sample populations that are being studied in clinical studies are often not reflecting real users. And this unfortunately limits regulatory confidence. When these studies are very expensive to perform, and so they typically recruit small populations. Overwhelmingly, these samples are very homogeneous. It's often people who are white, educated, and middle-aged and male. These studies also typically exclude people who are most likely to seek psychedelic therapy in the real world, people with psychiatric conditions or medical comorbidities. These are things that clinical research stays away from, typically because they like to prove that the drug product is efficacious within a specific population, such as only depression. But realistically, most people have more than one thing going on at a time. And so this really creates a sample population that doesn't represent the average person. We also see that these are highly controlled environments in these studies that differ quite drastically from what we see happening in community or clinical practice settings. And this leaves little translatability. It makes it really hard for us to go from clinical research to people actually using these substances in their regular lives. We see that there's an absence of real world designs, and we believe that this is because of a lack of consultation with real people who would like to access these substances. And lastly, we're seeing overwhelmingly a data ownership bottleneck. It isn't so much that there isn't the research out there, it's more so that these data sets are currently being siloed within institutions or companies, and nobody wants to share their data. And this means that unless we can compile all of these data sets together, we can't really accelerate the progress that we would like to see. Kind of compounding here on those gaps. A lot of the research that's currently being done in the psychedelic space is highly dependent on philanthropy. And so this means that very generous people are helping us to answer questions. However, we're really left waiting for those people to arrive. This means that we're not able to answer questions at a pace that we should be able to answer them. We know that psychedelics have been shown to positively affect a whole bunch of different symptoms and conditions, but we need some answers regarding the dosing, how much should people be taking, the environment that it happens within, and the type and duration of therapy. Lastly, there's a real lack of patient consultation. We know that there are centuries of traditional and indigenous knowledge and experience that are missing from the literature. We know that there is an abundance of underground knowledge that is not making it to the academics. And so researchers really need to be consulting these people so that we can move things quicker. The reasons that people use psychedelics truly go beyond depression, anxiety, and diagnostic criterias. But unfortunately, most research is really geared towards answering questions for people who do use those things only for depression and anxiety. How will this research really impact the rest of the population and the different use cases for psychedelics? These are questions that we are left wondering. So what about drug development and a DIN for psilocybin? The current clinical research landscape works to make DINs. So we need to get the approval of the drug, you need to do the clinical trials, and then the clinical trials will lead to an approval that will generate a DIN so that when you go to the pharmacy, you can pick up that drug. Psychedelics like psilocybin probably won't be legalized without a DIN. And so that leaves us to wonder who will invest to develop largely unpatentable substances such as psilocybin. In order for DINs to get approved, we need to have GMP grade drug product. This is a specific kind of regulation for drug products. It's highly costly and requires a ton of investment in order to make a novel drug product GMP grade. We also need to have sufficient clinical data compiled for this drug to show the safety through clinical trials. Safety data, as I mentioned, can be compiled across a whole bunch of institutions, companies, sponsors, and investigators. But the thing is, not everybody shares. Overwhelmingly, nobody is sharing. And this means that we're kind of getting data in these different silos, and we're not getting the amalgamation, and we're not moving forward. So who's going to get it first? If we leave it up to these current streams of research, academic versus pharmaceutical, who will get it first? It probably will not be the academic and grant-led side of things, given by the limited funding through government and philanthropic efforts. The pharmaceutical side of things, because it's unpatentable, again, we have this limited investment interest. The results will likely be indication specific, and they almost certainly will not champion therapy as a necessary component alongside psychedelic treatment. Finally, because this is a shareholder-driven effort, the resulting drug product will likely be outrageously expensive.
I just want to comment on that too. I mean, this was one of the highlighted points in the constitutional challenge that we brought up against the government of Canada when we told the government that essentially for these reasons, it was not possible to run a clinical trial at the time. They told us, to partner with pharmaceutical companies. They told us to partner with research institutions, and even their own experts at Health Canada gave us these reasons for why clinical research was not possible. And that ended up being the verdict from Health Canada's own experts on why the minister should be approving Section 56s, because clinical research would not be possible, because it always comes down to who's going to fund it. And if it's not patentable, if it's not profitable, it's not the pharmaceutical companies. And I believe even in many experts' opinions, a lot of the pharmaceutical funding that goes to academic institutions oftentimes lands on those same questions that those pharmaceutical companies find interesting. So, drugs that are going to be either popular, profitable, or patentable. So there really is, this massive issue right here on this slide with who's going to fund this research if it's not the institutions that we traditionally rely on for bringing drugs to market, the universities or the pharma companies. So I just wanted to highlight how important this bit is and kind of note that even Health Canada had acknowledged that in our constitutional challenge.
Would you like to take over from there? I think that was a good segue.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, what that really leaves us with then, right, is, and maybe the only evidence of proof is that there are sub companies that are working towards DINs. So, is that a good thing, or is there maybe some need for a bit of suspicion here? And certainly I'd like to explain why it may not always be positive. So as you were mentioning, whoever develops the first psychedelic compound, and I say psychedelic compound because it may not always be, the GMP product like psilocybin or MDMA, For patentability reasons, they may try to develop, a compound or a formulation that is patentable. They may have 7 years of what's called, I think, like not orphan drug status, but something similar where there's no competition. So because they've done the work to bring, even though it's not patentable, a drug to market, they're given those 7 years of protection as a way to make back or recuperate the costs. And with psychedelics at such a pivotal moment, it would be unfortunate if that was to price people out of the market. In many ways, it could actually slow down research, as only those people would be able to access the substance. And I really feel like in the spirit of the industry, that's not something that may be beneficial for people. So the price of that legal psychedelic too could be, whatever they want it to be. Could be $30,000 a dose, $10,000. It really is a question of how much money or investment was put into the discovery and development of that drug process. And so ultimately, legal, but for who, right? Is it for everyone, or is it just for those who can pay? Does the process of achieving a DIN actually make it more accessible for people, or does it put up certain guardrails and barriers that stop or slow research and actually push people away from being able to access it? That's some of the things that we're really worried about. And on the next slide here, I'll also show you how it may affect the way that we administer psychedelics too. So there was this chart that I saw the other day. I wish I had it on here, but you can maybe imagine it. It's a bullseye with rings on it. And in the middle of it is Spravato. And that bullseye essentially represents, as you get closer to the middle, that's the target. So on the outside is phase 1. As you get closer, phase 2, phase 3, and then the groups that have actually brought drug products to market, like Spravato, have hit that bullseye. And even though it's a bullseye for the company, it may not be a bullseye for people who are looking to access ketamine. And for me, this is very real. And if we look at how long ketamine has been used, the amount of wonderful research that's been put into it, but still notice there's a bit of a problem with patients trying to access the drug. We can start to understand why, but by looking at this as a use case. So ketamine should be one of the cheapest drugs out there. It costs really nothing. However, for those who have a diagnosis for which ketamine, Spravato, can be used, it will cost several thousands of dollars to access the treatment, which is paired with therapy used in a clinical setting. And then also they charge hundreds of dollars for the drug that should cost, only a couple cents. So that's unfortunate. It also restricts it really to just the specific diagnosis under which it's been studied and is usable for. Unfortunately, as well, when the clinical research was done, the people who are doing making the decisions on how to put together the research are not always focused on patient outcomes. What they're focused on is how do we get the research done, prove efficacy, and the incentives are always on short-term efficacy, not necessarily long-term efficacy. So while anecdotally, I've heard stories of people who have used ketamine with therapy and had great success behind that, the Spravato method, or the amount of therapy used with Spravato, was really the limited or the least amount of therapy necessary in order to get the drug approved. And so all of a sudden, when we start combining drugs like psychedelics that research and experience shows that perhaps should be joined with therapy, the drug companies are incentivized to reduce the number of therapy hours as much as possible, if not totally remove them. And that certainly seems to be the way things are going. So that's not always what we want. Although it's legal access, unfortunately now it's legal, patented, high cost access only to those who can access it and can afford it. And again, within the psychedelic industry landscape, whatever you want to call it, that doesn't seem like the way we should be doing research. It seems more like it protects the organizations who are able to get there first, less the medicine and stakeholders who are involved. So that's just an example of how this legal access can actually concentrate the market and reduce access, not always expand it. All right, next slide, please. And of course, there's MDMA, which was MAPS, then transitioned to Lykos and resilience. And this is something that we're also kind of worried about. There's lots of years of fundraising, um, mostly through stakeholders. And now it's, you know, an organization that I don't know if we can get the answers to things like what will the cost of the drug and treatment be. Recently, I've also heard that Resilience is trying to reduce and get away from the number of therapy hours. And ever since the decision by the FDA to reject their application, it looks more and more like these traditional decisions that were made with Spravato are leaking their way into Resilience. So how do we reduce the cost of the therapy, or sorry, the amount of therapy and cost of therapy, thus reducing perhaps long-term efficacy in hopes to achieve just short-term gains. I don't know if that means more therapy or more access to MDMA will be needed. But certainly I hope you start to see that there's kind of this disconnect with long-term efficacy and interests of the organizations that are doing the research. So will therapy be required or not? We don't know. What will the cost be? We don't know. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we may have legal access, but again, it will be for patients who can pay or whose insurance covers it. It may push away other researchers and people who are trying to access the drug, and may not be the outcome we want. Now, I should also say I'm not in any way trying to tarnish or shame what's going on here with MAPS and with Johnson & Johnson. I'm simply saying that the pharmaceutical model that's being employed by both of these organizations inherently is limiting for patients. It's inherently costly, and it inherently tries to move away from increasing the efficacy of the treatment, in these cases through therapy hours, in hopes to cut costs and shorten the amount of time to approval. And next slide. So we really, throughout the process of trying to design these trials and finding out what a solution would look for or would look like, we really wanted to highlight the importance of stakeholders in all of this, because at the end of the day, the stakeholders are the patients. They are the patients' families. They are the doctors. They're the therapists and nurses. They are all of us in this room who care about psychedelic medicine. They are all of the researchers who may join this, and any person out there who may one day access psychedelics. So we want voices to matter. We want to hear from people. And really the future of legalization, and when I say that, I mean broad scale legalization, it is in, unfortunately, very few hands of the company's shareholders. And we want to change that. So, with research not really being a very fair field, we want to find ways to make it more fair. And what I think that means is we need to get more players on the field. So normally the average person has no input in the direction of research, but we really want to change that. We want the stakeholders to be there driving the research forward. We want them to be consulted, not just the patients, but the practitioners who will be delivering this, and the family members. So really at the end of the day, the way you fix that is you follow the money, right? In the first case, it's the shareholders, the private owners, those with the money that are directing research. So in a model where we want the average stakeholder to be able to direct research, they need to be in charge of funding it as well. And that's really where our model came from, a stakeholder funded model, which would necessitate stakeholder involvement. I think it's a necessary way for us to move forward, and really systematically the only way we can ensure that all stakeholder voices are heard. Anything to add on that, Kamaya, before we jump into Q&A for our first one here?
No, that was amazing. Thank you so much. And I just, before we wrap up, just want to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. Super excited to start discussion and answering any questions that you might have.
I can ask a question. Let me just put on my video. Hi.
Hey there.
So I was just in Israel, where they have a trauma model for ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, where there's one psychiatrist and a nurse who deliver ketamine, and there's like 8 or 9 therapists with their clients, so that it's pretty cost effective, and the ketamine doesn't cost really very much at all because it's the same ketamine that is used for anesthetic, etc. Is there at least a way, while we're working on other um, other sort of drug and advocacies to encourage hubs to use it, like, because I know I have a couple of friends that are anesthesiologists that would be able to do the same thing with a number of different clinicians, clients.
Yeah, I can jump in there, and then Maya, feel free to jump in too. But Kathy, that's actually how a lot of this really started, right? Is we were working with hubs, and that was like what 2 or 3 years ago. We started using that word hubs of practitioners, because obviously an individual treatment where you've got a psychiatrist or a doctor, a nurse, and a therapist all together in a room, that's really expensive. That doctor specifically is very, very expensive, yet they need to be there to administer the psilocybin through the SAP. So if we can get 8 people or 8 therapists all doing treatment on the exact same day, we've just cut that, doctor's cost. We divided it by however many people are there, sometimes 6 or 8 people. That's a fantastic way to cut costs. For some of the reasons I described in the beginning, though, all 8 of those people were going through the same SAP kind of BS process where, it would take a couple of months to get the approval. There were lawyers involved, and really all of them were still spending about $5,000 in order to access psilocybin through the SAP. So when we looked at the cost of doing, I don't know, let's just say 5 people at $5,000 each, we realized that that's actually quite close to the cost of just running a clinical trial. Not at the time, we found ways to bring the cost down, but that sort of thinking, this hub thinking, is what brought us towards, a clinical trial model that would be closer to, what's cost effective and what's actually obtainable by patients. So what you're describing does sound like exactly the same kind of thought process we went through. The only thing we've done in our model is maybe even gone one step further and looked at group therapy as well. And obviously we'll get more into that in the future, because we don't want to talk too much about the trial now. We want to kind of build up to it, because this kind of background information is very important. But that's absolutely the way people should be thinking, is not only what's economical, but how is it used, outside of the clinic. All those things will make it more real world based. And I mean, at the end of the day, if you consult the stakeholders, right, again, the people out there using it today, either through models like what you're explaining or through these group models, is how a lot of these treatments are being done.
But am I correct in assuming that ketamine does not require any request from the government, Health Canada, for administration?
So if you're going to be researching it, like any clinical trial, you still need to make a request to use it, I believe, unless you're doing observational research. So if you're looking to access Johnson Johnson's Spravato, like that's a prescribable drug, and then ketamine in general too is prescribable. It would just be up to the jurisdiction where you are, as to how it can be administered, I believe.
I will add on. I just thought of a tidbit after Spencer had finished speaking. But another reason why we went this route is because SAP patients, we can't study the results that come out of that, unfortunately. They don't add to research, and that's something that we feel is really lacking right now. We're really trying to bolster the safety data so that we can get legalization moving and advocate for that. And clinical trials is basically the only way that we can do that.
Very good point. Great. Any other questions or comments from anyone?
So really the big thing is we need either philanthropy or the self-funded model. I guess you guys are probably going to talk about that more in the next sessions, but
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, what we really wanted to do here was try and explain why, when you're only relying on philanthropy or only relying on pharmaceutical companies or institutions, really where the money lies, why or how, where the money comes from, how that impacts the decisions that are being made within the research realm. So if you want the outcomes to matter for stakeholders, I do believe you need to go to stakeholders for funding. And this reminds me of this quote by Charlie Munger, I think his name is, who is the VP at Berkshire Hathaway, where Warren Buffett was. And he said, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. And really what that means is if you incentivize something, that's what you're going to get. So if you incentivize, treatments, right, that are profitable for drug companies but don't really treat people, then your outcomes on the other side of that pharmaceutical industrial complex are going to be, drugs that just are kind of band-aids that don't really get to the root problem, yet they make a lot of money. So that's really what we wanted to highlight here is how the funding affects how people think in research terms, how they design research studies, and what their goals are.
mm-hmm.
And I don't know, just because it came to mind, another one too is like it sounds kind of brutal, but a patient cured being a patient lost. I doubt any individual thinks like that, but that is the way the system operates, unfortunately. So that's true again when the funding is coming from organizations or shareholders, but certainly not the outcomes that patients want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
All right. Okay, if there are no other questions here, I mean, I don't want to hold people for any reason. Thank you very much for coming today. We'll have this recorded. So if at any point you want to come back and look at it, I'm sure John will throw it up on YouTube. So you or other people can watch it. And all I would say is I just hope you can make it to the next call, which will be next Wednesday at the exact same time. For that one, we will be going over the second part, which is just going to be the patient-funded model. So again, today we really talked about the background. And next time, we're going to really go into how this model works, how you can run a patient-funded model, and all of the considerations that go into that. The third one, we'll talk specifically about our study. So I really hope you can all come and join those. Hopefully it'll start to make a bit more sense, and we'll be able to bring you along for the journey that we've gone through over the past couple of years. So thank you very much for your time tonight. If you have any other questions, feel free to send us an email or bring them to the next call.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Thank you.